Good evening, everyone. My name is Nico, and I am the National Graphic Designer for the United Nations Association of Australia Young Professionals. And on behalf of the entire team and the broader UNAA, I would like to welcome you to our second My Climate Action event for 2022, Mental Health and Wellbeing. I would like to also start by respectfully acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land across Australia in which we meet this evening and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples here today. And I would also like to acknowledge all the people across the globe who have for generations continued to work and protect the natural environments we rely on, and who continue to hold the vital knowledge we need to repair our relationship with the planet and to address climate change. I understand we have a few people joining us from across the globe outside of Australia too, including from my homeland of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So welcome to everyone. And now I'd like to introduce our National Young Professionals President, Joel Lindsay, who will provide a brief introduction to the organisation and tonight's event.
Thanks, Nico, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining. You're all here for a reason. I assume it's quite similar. We're all caring about the planet, climate change, and mental health of people as we go through this really important topic. Before we start, I'd like to give a quick introduction to who we are and what we're doing and why we're doing it. So we are the United Nations Association of Australia Young Professionals. We are a national network of young professionals run by and for young professionals under the auspice of UNAA as our parent group. We have active teams across the country, and we work to inspire, inform, and engage young professionals whom might have been stuck in their career or looking to climb that ladder back into the world of volunteering, advocacy, and issues they're really passionate about to get involved in the work in the larger world around them. So that's what we do. We really focus on skills development, mentoring, networking, and really the social and learning development aspect of all this issues advocacy, so you can engage in your passions internationally with local and personal action. So I guess on that note, this year we're doing an online series of 4 events across 2022, focusing on My Climate Action, really basic ways that you can practically engage in climate change in the world around you. Our first event earlier in the year was about ecosystem restoration, really getting your hands dirty, using your green thumbs to get outside into your community gardens, into reforestation, replanting our native plants around us in our communities to really, climate action through local action. Tonight is our second event in that series, a really important one for a lot of people. We're really focusing tonight on mental health and well-being, with a strong focus on resilience, because as we are all aware and all agree, climate change is quite a big concern for our generation especially, but for people coming before us and after us as well. Staying mentally strong and fit is critical. It's quite an issue. It's an issue close to a lot of the hearts of the people in our committee, in our wider UNA family, and I'm sure a lot of you watching. So really wanted to put an event on to discuss the realities and practicalities of climate change, where we're going, and how mental health research is keeping up with that, but really some practical steps for moving forward and staying strong and engaged in an important issue that we can't shy away from, but is quite mentally and emotionally draining to deal with. So we have 2 fantastic speakers for you tonight. I'd like to extend my sincere welcome and thanks to them for sharing their time with us. We have Professor Fiona Charlson from UQ and also Tara Crandon. So we're going to hear from both of them for 10 minutes each. We're going to do a quick Q&A with me, and then we're going to open questions up for the floor. So really want you to get your ideas and questions in the Q&A function. We'll be asking our 2 experts the Q&As at the end, and that's really your opportunity to engage in the issues, get your questions answered. So without further ado, thank you, Professor Charlson.
Thanks everyone for inviting me tonight. I'm just going to get my slides up here. So I thought I would start this evening by sort of setting the scene about what we know from the research about the mental health impacts of climate change, because they're not always obvious, and it's actually really quite complex. And I think the complexity can be shown in this slide here, which is actually a hypothetical model. It's not research-based, strong research-based. But it's very plausible. So what this does is shows, you know, if we place our risk to mental health and well-being in the centre and think about the system around us, society around us, these are all the potential ways in which our mental health is being impacted in the face of climate change. And I'll show you actually a real life model that we've done a little bit later. But you don't need to sort of read every word on that page. Really, the point is that this is a really complex issue. It's more than trauma from bushfires. It's more than trauma from a flood, losing a home, etc. Those impacts. It's much broader on all level of society. So if we were to talk about this in a frame of thinking about different layers, we've got primary, secondary and tertiary level impacts. And these are the climate change related events that have been shown to have impact on mental health. So we start with the really primary direct impacts. They're the ones we know well. There's heat, rainfall and humidity, floods, fires and storms, big storms such as cyclones, etc. And then we've got kind of these more indirect or secondary impacts, which are sort of a flow on from those more direct impacts. These include things, and these lists aren't exhaustive, but these include things like drought, which is obviously an extended period without rainfall, sea level rise, land degradation, and land degradation is a really broad term to represent a lot of different, more specific things. Air pollution, physical health is impacted by climate change, and it also has a strong bidirectional relationship with mental health. And water and food security, I mean, we've seen here in Australia with the price of lettuce and, you know, real threats to our water and food security, and they have very strong impacts on our mental health. Then we've got sort of even a sort of broader impact range of impacts which act all across society. So these include things such as displacement and migration, and then the loss of connection to land, health system pressures, reduced access to mental health care, reduced economic productivity, agricultural losses, reduced financial security, strain on community cohesion and social capital, loss of nature spaces and that connection to nature, which is so important in terms of our well-being, and conflict and political instability, which we are seeing in a number of countries overseas as a result of climate change already. So if I bring it back to Australia for a minute, I'm just going to do a case study of heat, because the latest IPCC report for our region has identified heat as the particular vulnerability for Australia. We are already warmer than the global average, our land temperature here in Australia. Heat is going to be absolutely huge in terms of its impact on human health and mental health. These mental health impacts are really significant, and as I said, and potentially impact many more people than any of those other direct impacts that I mentioned, such as floods, fires, cyclones and droughts put together. We know from the literature that all types of mental health emergency department presentations go up during extremely hot days. We see increases in self-harm and suicide rates, increased psychiatric related mortality. There are certain psychotropics or medications for treating a range of mental disorders that increase the risk of heat stroke. And heat also increases the vulnerability of the brain to the toxic effects of substances such as alcohol. So I'll just fly through this one, but it's a real spectrum of mental health impacts. So it's not just mental health. We're talking about a range of really quite specific things. And Tara's going to talk about climate anxiety and a little bit more detail, but we've now also got these environmental or climate specific constructs, which is what you guys are maybe really aware of and as young professionals, and that's maybe what's driven you to turn up tonight to hear about this topic. So we've got climate anxiety that Tara will talk about. Solastalgia has been around for a while, but it's a term that's used to talk about that real disconnection from place, so from home, from connection to land, and all of that sense of identity that is associated with that place. Eco-grief is kind of what it says. It's a grief, it's an emotion that is attached to what we're seeing in terms of the environment and ecological decline. This is about climate anxiety, but and Tara will talk about this more, but I just want to show that there's a new study, well, it's not that new now, but it's still very recent, study of 10,000 young people in 10 countries found that nearly 60% felt very worried or extremely worried about the impacts of climate change. I mean, very worried or extremely worried is not a measure of mental health, but it has the potential to flow on to negative mental health impacts, but 60% is extremely high. So this is a really widely felt issue for people. If we're thinking about who are our priority populations on a global level, who is going to be impacted most? Young people. I don't need to sort of explain to you why young people are sort of bearing the brunt of this. Those with pre-existing mental illness will also be disproportionately impacted. Low and middle income countries and small island developing states, such as those to the north of us, are particularly vulnerable here. And unfortunately, they are going to be disproportionately impacted. And they did not cause, well, most of them did not cause what we're seeing with climate change. So our Indigenous people, First Nations people from both here in Australia, but around the world, and farmers are also probably a priority population to be thinking about. So the research gaps are substantial, and I know that you guys in the discussion tonight want to talk about a more solutions approach. You know, what can you do, or what can communities do to support people with the mental health impacts of climate change? If we look at the research, just the research, there's actually not a lot there to guide us. Most of I would say the research in the mental health and climate change space is pretty early compared to other health areas. It's lagging, and more than 80% of the research that does exist just explores what are the mental health impacts, how big are they. It explores those links between climate change and mental health without actually giving us any solutions or helping us understand which factors are going to be protective or act as a risk. So that's the kind of bad news. But having said that, there is still a lot that we can talk about as a group in terms of what can be done both on an individual level, but also through your work or leveraging policy change, etc. So this is a paper that I might pop it in the chat a bit later once I've finished talking. This is a paper that came out lately around the global priorities for climate change and mental health. And this was done with a number of my colleagues, some at different UN departments such as UNDP, World Health Organization is a strong partner of mine, also the Wellcome Trust in the UK. So this was done by kind of the leaders, global leaders in research around what we think some of the research priorities are. And you'll see that there's maybe not explicitly in these research priorities, but in the paper, working with youth is flagged as something that's really important. So this is what I'll finish on. This is actually some research we've done out in Stanthorpe in Queensland. Stanthorpe, for those who are not locally placed, is a rural, largely agricultural, but also a highly high tourism area, regional town, about 3 hours west of Brisbane. And it has been really heavily impacted with some extreme weather events in the last decade. It had a 10-year drought, which only recently broke, to the point where they completely ran out of water, no drinking water, like no water. They had to truck their water in. So obviously that had impacts on agriculture. Employment went down, people had to leave town. They were one of the first towns to experience the 2019-2020 bushfires. When the bushfires went south over the New South Wales border, they were blanketed in the smoke. They've had a number of severe storms and flooding. So it's just been one event on top of another. So we went out there, we spoke to a lot of local people, and we took their stories about how these events are impacting social emotional well-being or mental health. And this is what we came up with. It's a very, very complex system. This is how they are telling us everything is interacting in this region to impact mental health. And I guess the point to this is that that looks very scary, and it's all very doom and gloom, what I've told you so far. But there's an immense opportunity in models like this. So everything that is on that, in that, it's called a causal loop diagram, holds the potential to intervene to improve or break those cycles to improve mental health. So that's the next stage of our research. So I don't have the answers as to what those intervention targets are just yet, but I can see a number in there based on, you know, hypotheses of what some intervention points could be, and a number of them are policy related. So I'm going to leave that there and hand over to Tara.
Thanks, Fiona. That was a great presentation and a really good overview to the topic. I'm just going to share my screen now as well. Just one moment, sorry. Okay. Can everybody see this okay? Okay, I'm hoping that that's a yes. So thanks so much for having me here to talk about climate anxiety. This is a research topic that is quite important to me. So I'm a psychologist and a PhD candidate, and my PhD topic is really on climate anxiety. So this is something that anybody can experience, and I'm not really going to give you a formal definition of what climate anxiety is, because I'm going to hazard a guess that probably most of the people who are listening tonight have probably experienced some kind of anxiety, dread, or worry about climate change, even if that's just for a fleeting moment. So climate anxiety can be that sense of dread that you feel if you hear news of biodiversity loss or natural disasters. it can be that sense of panic that you feel or discomfort that you feel when you see trash cans overflowing, or maybe when you think about how you might be or will be impacted by climate change, or maybe when you think about how your children or their children's futures might be impacted. And it can even be that fleeting sense of panic that you experience when maybe you've gone to the grocery store and you've forgotten your reusable bag and you realize you have to pick up a plastic one. Climate anxiety is that initial alarm bell that's telling you that something needs to change. And I hope that the examples that I've just given you really illustrate how different the experience can be for different people. So it can really range in how severe it might be and how helpful or adaptive it is. Now, we like to think that climate anxiety involves thoughts, feelings, and behaviours. And these thoughts and behaviours can range on a spectrum from unhelpful to helpful. So someone might be having helpful thoughts, like maybe they're problem solving the issue, maybe they're thinking about their own role in protecting or restoring the planet or in the climate crisis. Maybe they're acting in helpful ways through pro-environmental behaviour, supporting their community. And when they're having these helpful thoughts and acting in helpful ways, we might actually see a gain in functioning. So maybe they're more connected to their values, maybe they're feeling more empowered, maybe they're more engaged with the things that matter to them or are important to them. But on the flip side, we might also have unhelpful thoughts and act in unhelpful ways. So somebody might catastrophize the issue and think that the absolute worst is going to happen and that there's absolutely no hope at all. And maybe that means that they feel less in control, and so they avoid doing anything related to climate change or protecting the planet. And so then we might see a bit of a loss in their functioning. So maybe they're not able to engage with their relationships, with their work, with the things that are important to them, and because of how they're feeling and because they are quite overwhelmed and paralyzed. So it can really range for different people. Now, children and young people are particularly affected by climate anxiety, and this is understandable. We know from research that young people are more likely to experience climate anxiety. And we know that young people are more likely to be vulnerable developmentally, physically, and psychologically to the negative impacts of climate change. And we also know that they will likely be more predisposed and exposed to climate-related stresses like natural disasters across the full course of their lifespan. So this is a really understandable experience. And as Fiona mentioned a little bit earlier, that there was this study that was published recently that looked at young people from 10 different countries. So they looked at 10,000 participants. It's a huge number of participants who gave their voice to this survey. And these were from young people aged 16 to 25 years old. And 84% of them said that they felt moderately to extremely anxious about climate change. So this is absolutely a global phenomenon. So if you are experiencing climate anxiety, you're absolutely not alone. And it's a very understandable response. Now, as I mentioned earlier, though, climate anxiety is not going to look the same for everybody. There are going to be differences in how people feel and how they think and how they respond. And we published a paper earlier this year in Nature Climate Change that sort of talked about this, about how different environments can shape climate anxiety and really lead it to becoming more helpful or unhelpful for some people. So if these environments can shape climate anxiety, to some degree, we can really intervene and try to shape how we cope so that we're coping in more helpful ways for ourselves and for the planet, rather than feeling overwhelmed and burdened. And this is just a little bit of an overview of some of the different factors that might shape how you feel about climate change and the way that you perceive the threats, and thus the kind of anxiety that you experience. So we can see from individual factors like how you cope, what your psychological traits are, your development, whether you're physically vulnerable, your physical space, all the way to your peers, family, school, community influences on young people, and then also governmental influences. So the kind of country that you're living in, the society that you're living in, the sort of technology that you're exposed to that can really impact how you're feeling about climate change and how you might cope. And this is bringing me to a survey that we've conducted this year, and I'm just going to share with you some preliminary findings. So we ran a survey of 251 young people, particularly in Queensland, but there are a couple of young people from all over Australia too. And these young people were aged 12 to 19 years old. And what we really tried to explore was how different young people might feel and think about climate change and the differences that you might see. So we saw a high proportion of young people saying that they felt sad, they felt anxious, they felt angry, they felt hopeless. But then we also saw that young people said that they were feeling determined, that they felt hopeful, and that they felt connected. And again, these are some of the thoughts that young people shared. So some young people were saying that they think that there's no future, that they think that the worst is going to happen with climate change. But then there were also young people sharing that they think that they have a role in protecting the planet, that when they think about climate change, they think about what they can do to help, and that they want to help in a meaningful way. And they also try to think about all of the people who are doing really good things to help stop climate change, and that can help them. So when we're thinking about how we can actually cope with climate change, how we can really bounce back from all of this climate adversity, we do have to recognize that, you know, while we want to feel hopeful and empowered and we want to feel engaged with the climate crisis, sometimes that can be really hard and it can be overwhelming and it can feel like a lot. And so what researchers and psychologists are starting to suggest is that it's really about trying to strengthen our resilience. And when I say resilience, I'm talking more about transformational resilience, which is not trying to, or the aim is not really trying to just make you cope with climate change and just accept that it's happening and just take the blows. But really it's about trying to transform how you cope and transform the situation by helping you to respond, recover, prepare for, prevent and protect the planet and your own mental health. And I'm going to talk to you about how you might actually try to start doing some of those things. And I'm going to use a particular model called the resilient growth model for building transformational resilience for climate traumas and stresses. So this is a model developed by Bob Doppelt. And Bob really focuses on the idea that we can develop this transformational resilience through two key areas of skills. So we can try and develop presencing skills. We might like to think of presencing skills as emotion-focused skills, so around regulation and supporting our mental health. And then the second set of skills is around purposing skills. So this is a little bit more around action, what you can do and finding your meaning through all of this existential dread. So we're focusing a little bit first on the presencing and regulation. When we think about climate anxiety, it's very much a future-oriented response. So sometimes when we are worrying so much about climate change, and a lot of us do, we can get really overwhelmed and we can get swept up in that anxiety and we can be taken out of the present moment. And when that happens and when those emotions are really intense for us, it can prevent us from being able to engage with the things that are important to us, particularly around, you know, helping to mitigate climate change. And so it's really important for us to be able to regulate ourselves and bring ourselves back into the present moment so that we can do the things that are important to us. And there are these three kind of ways that we might try to do that. And I'll walk you through them a little bit more specifically. The first is trying to ground yourself. So this is around centering and stabilizing. The second is around remembering your own personal strengths, your resources, and your social support networks. And then the third is around observing your reactions and thoughts non-judgmentally and especially with self-compassion. So I'm going to talk about those in more depth and what they might actually look like for you. So when we talk about grounding, this is really around bringing yourself back into the moment. So trying not to get swept up with all of your worries. And yes, it is really important to sometimes think about the future, but sometimes it's also really important to come back into the present and think about what you can do right now. And you might try and do that through two different ways. So you can try and build up your emotion-focused strategies, but you could also try and build up your situation-focused strategies. So the difference there is that emotion-focused strategies are really around you trying to help yourself emotionally cope. So that might be like spending time in nature. It might be talking with friends. It might be doing deep breathing exercises or mindfulness. And then situation-focused coping strategies are a little bit more focused on trying to deal with the threats that you're feeling really worried about. So that might particularly be pro-environmental behavior. And research shows that doing things like spending time in nature, engaging in climate action or pro-environmental behavior can actually be really protective of your well-being and your mental health. And then the other thing that I wanted to bring up with grounding is that it's really important sometimes, and I think we don't often acknowledge that this is a lot. It is a huge burden for us to be trying to problem solve these huge threats. As Fiona mentioned, they are very complex threats. And so sometimes it's really important for us to be able to take breaks from climate change news when needed or necessary. Otherwise, we will burn out and we will become overburdened, and that can impact our ability to come back and do what's important to us and meaningful. So it's important to be able to recognize how you're going and to tune in and know that it's okay to take a break. We all need breaks. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're abandoning the topic. You can certainly come back to it with more capacity if you give yourself those breaks. So really grounding, as a bit of a summary, is I like to think about it like you're a ship in a storm and you're being rocked by all of these threats and all of this stress, and it can feel really overwhelming and like a lot. And grounding is really you just putting down that anchor so that you are a little bit more stable and centered through it all. So that's one of the things that you can do with trying to regulate how you're feeling. Another is trying to remember that you do have strengths and trying to connect with those strengths and resources. So, a lot of the people here, for example, I'm sure that you have so many strengths that you can draw on, and that you do have coping strategies that are already getting you through and are at play. And it's important to acknowledge and recognize those. There's always more things that we could be doing, but it's really important to recognize what you are already doing and that those are little wins too. And it's important in all of this for us to connect with other people. We can feel quite alone in a lot of these issues, particularly climate change can be something that sometimes we feel guilty about our own behaviors and we can feel alone. And so it's really important to connect with other people to be able to talk about it. And then also, there are so many online resources that you can access, whether that's for your mental health, and learning different ways to help you cope emotionally, but it's also around different things that you can do to try and mitigate climate change, tangible actions that you might take, but also accessing resources around how to be safe during natural disasters and things like that. Having those resources and learning about what tangible actions you can take can sort of help you to feel like you have a bit of a plan and that you are a little bit prepared for what's coming and what is happening. And then something I really want to emphasize is that it's so important for us to be able to be open to discussing this topic, especially non-judgmentally. Everybody responds in their own way, and everybody is going to be feeling different things at different times. Climate change is the kind of crisis that is going to continually trigger you in different ways. Sometimes those are going to be negative and sometimes they might be positive ways, and everybody's at a different stage. So it's really important for us to be able to just share with each other what we're experiencing. And a lot of those experiences will be really shared and common between us. But we have to be able to do that non-judgmentally. It is understandable and it's complex and it's uncertain, and everyone is in their own journey with that. And alongside that, it's important for us to be able to view ourselves and how we're responding with the lens of self-compassion. So, we are having to deal with these huge burdens, and it's really important for us to know that it's okay if you're anxious and if you are struggling and if sometimes you are feeling overwhelmed. It's understandable. It's important for us to be able to be there for ourselves and support ourselves when we need it. So you might like to ask yourself, I'm going through something, I'm struggling. This is a human experience and it's understandable given what we're going through. So what kind of support do I need right now? So really being that person there to keep you steady, being your own anchor. And then really the second set of skills, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is around purposing. So this is more around action. So what you can actually do to try and find meaning, hope, and direction despite and through adversity. And this was something that really helped me when I was trying to reconcile my own feelings about climate change and was feeling a lot of anxiety and anger and guilt and confusion, trying to find a little bit of purpose for myself, which is how I kind of came into doing a PhD topic, was really, really helpful. It helped me to be able to channel my anxiety in a way that was what I felt was helpful for me, but also was helpful to support other people and then to support those people with helping the planet. So it's really important to try and watch for new insights, try and figure out where you can make meaning in life. What's your role in the climate crisis? Where do you fit in? What can you do to try and contribute? What's important to you in terms of contributing? Where do you see your life meaning being long term? And we also talk a little bit in the research about this idea of meaning making, and that can be quite protective of well-being, as research shows, particularly in young people. So this is really around trying to identify, rather than thinking about climate change through a lens of hopelessness and as a crisis and something that is going to be so challenging and difficult for us, but more trying to identify the things that people are doing that are really meaningful for the planet and for us. And it's important to sometimes remember those things that people are doing and celebrate those wins, even though they sometimes might feel quite small. That can help you just push yourself a little bit more and re-engage with the things that are important to you. And then the third thing around purposing skills is trying to identify what your values are. What do you want to live by? What's important to you? What's your life going to be about? When you are going about your life, what are the things that are important to you around protecting the planet? Is that supporting other people? Is that things like recycling? Is that around restoring the environment? Is that gardening? What does that look like for you? Everyone's going to be different and everyone's going to have different values. So it can be helpful to identify what those values are that you have. And then we try and harvest some hope through aligning ourselves to those values through our action. So if you have values around, supporting other people emotionally with climate change, maybe your actions might look like reaching out to others or holding spaces where people can talk about climate change. Or if your values are more around protecting the planet or restoring the planet, maybe those actions will fall a little bit more within those lines. Maybe that's around community gardening, or it might be around policy change or climate action. So your actions really should line up with what's important to you in particular and what your values are. That will be more sustainable for you moving forward in your life, to be acting in ways that are actually important to you, rather than this is what I should do or this is what is expected of me. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea about, what you can do with how you're feeling about climate change. I know that it's a bit of a general overview, but hopefully it'll be a bit of a start, and hopefully you found this a little bit helpful. Thanks so much for listening, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you to both of our incredible speakers. I'd like to invite you both back on camera. Awesome. To have a quick chat about some questions. I must admit, I almost forgot to come back on camera because I was so engaged in what you're talking about, Tara. But I'm easily distracted, so maybe that's my issue. And just a quick shout out to link both of your talks together. If you are in Queensland, do go to Stanthorpe. It's beautiful. Get out in the nature there. Girraween National Park is incredible. And if you're of drinking age, the cider and wines are quite good as well. You both covered so much. I guess I want to do if we can, and use my presidential privilege to bring it back to something I'm quite interested in, Fiona. Your international career working on mental health policy and climate change policy is quite impressive, to say the least. I'd love to hear a little bit about, your experiences overseas and what really is going on in the wider world on this topic. Like how, to your experience, where is this sort of, research hitting the policy road, as it were?
Take myself off. Yeah, it's a good question. So yeah, as you kind of alluded to, I've had a long history of working with different sort of international health and humanitarian aid organisations. So I've lived and worked in Geneva for Médecins Sans Frontières. I've been in the field. I've worked with, not as an employee, but I've worked a lot as a consultant, I guess, with WHO and the UN, DP and various organisations, always around mental health. But to be honest, it's not until, well, if we talk about WHO as an example, they have, I can't remember what they call it, but they have a climate change division within, that's been there for a few years now. I couldn't give you the exact number. Obviously, climate change and health being WHO. It's not been until the last couple of years that I've really been able to engage with them on mental health. So I guess what I'm saying is the global community and particularly at the policy level, people are only just realizing the connections here and how huge an impact this is going to have on how important looking at mental health is when we're thinking about climate change and how it's going to impact on us as humans. The policy development is very early. There was a policy kind of brief released recently, which I helped them develop. It's not a policy. It's not a policy document per se, as in a detailed policy. We've done policy reviews for the Pacific region, and we're undertaking them in Australia, both at the federal, state and local government level for Queensland. And policy is very, very patchy when it comes to acknowledging the link between mental health and climate. There's lots of policy around health and lots of policy around climate change, but very rarely in the same document do we see the acknowledgement of mental health and climate change. So we are early. But it's also, I would say the appetite is there. I think the awareness levels are going through the roof right now. People have a thirst for wanting to understand this. And I can see, I'm optimistic about policies changing. I'm going to Canberra for a health leaders discussion. I can't remember what they're calling it on Monday. So talking about climate change and health policy in Australia. So, and that's never happened before. That's never happened before. So whilst there's been strong lobbying and advocacy through groups like the Climate and Health Alliance, that has never happened before. And I can tell you from our policy review, there is no clear mention of putting mental health in the same document to any meaningful degree in this country. So that's a fairly long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's awesome. It's good to hear, I guess, that work is happening now, but maybe it would be nice to hear that it started 30, 40 years ago. On that topic, I managed to glance through an article by Joelle Gergis at ANU, basically the other day, talking about how much of the issue of climate change and how we process it is quite similar to classical grief. And most people in this topic are at a different stage of grief, whether it's the anger or the denial or looking for solutions. based on what you just said, and I'd like to hear from both of you if possible, how much of the current, climate change, mental health spectrum of work draws on, other areas of psychology that are maybe more existing and, have longer and deeper volumes of research, like grief, like adjusting to loss and catastrophe?
Yeah, that's one for you, I think. Tara, I'll let you take that one.
That's a good one for me. Interestingly, there are quite a lot of different kinds of psychologists who are involved in this kind of space. For those of you who don't know much about like the psychology field, but we all usually have a different kind of background, and those backgrounds draw on lots of different theories. Like grief is one of them. You might have a specialty in that, but there are other backgrounds as well. And some of them might be like socio-economic frameworks, or it might be like systems theory, or it might be more around cognitive behavior theory. And these theories definitely play a part in how people have been thinking about climate anxiety. Interestingly, I would say that it is, like Fiona has mentioned, quite early and emerging in how we're thinking about climate anxiety and other responses to climate change, other emotional responses. So we're still really trying to conceptualize and understand what it is. But yeah, I definitely do think that people are trying to draw on existing frameworks to be able to do that. Just as an example, with conceptualizing climate anxiety on our end, we recently wrote a paper about how you could use an existential framework as well as a cognitive behavior theory framework to look at climate anxiety and what's involved with it, which is sort of part of the model, that the basic model that I showed you guys earlier before. This is really set in stone theories that we see in psychology, and we're just kind of adapting some of this stuff to be able to explain what climate anxiety is. But I have seen papers that do this for grief, for resilience, and for other things like denial too. The reasons why denial might be happening from a psychological perspective.
Yeah, it's good. I was quite interested in how that crossover works, given that we are there. Been a ton of awesome questions coming in from the group online. A lot of them are very smart, targeted long questions, so we might have to try and group some together as we go. One of the ones that caught my eye was, is it helpful to think of climate anxiety, I guess, to a point, as a healthy pressure for action? And can that, be used to lead to an empowerment, of a movement, essentially, that, we have to act, sort of thing?
Do you mind if I take this one, Fiona? Absolutely. Any of the work that we do as psychologists when we're thinking about supporting people with climate anxiety, our aim is not to get rid of anxiety. We think that it is really important for people to feel anxious. It is a normal experience to feel anxious, and it's necessary when you are faced with a threat. How the heck are you going to prepare for it if you're not anxious? You absolutely do need to feel anxiety. And in some ways, it's interesting to know, why might you not be feeling anxiety if you're not, and what's going on there? How can we help you to feel a little bit more anxious? Not to the point that you're overwhelmed, but to the point where it motivates you to act and prepare a little bit. That's what we need. We need more energy around this to be able to create the change that's needed to deal with these threats.
Awesome. Next one that caught my eye was a classic, what career advice, both of you, would you give for a young professional looking for meaningful work in the climate change space? Where is that impact job? I'm curious too.
I'll have a crack at this first. I guess my answer is going to be a little bit unhelpful, maybe, in that I really think that the sky's the limit. So it's I have a really optimistic view about the opportunities and roles, opportunities for impact from young people and young professionals in particular in this space. We are now, I would say, in a political environment in Australia where the voices that have been there are now, I think, going to have much more of an opportunity to be heard. And in terms of what that career looks like, I think if it was me, and I do think about this in terms of how do I make the most meaningful impact. And for me, it's looking back and drawing on my career experiences, and I acknowledge that I'm much older than other people on this call. So I have a bigger bucket of stuff to draw on, but everyone has life experiences, not just work experiences, life experiences that can be of great benefit to making impactful change. And I think it's about tapping into that and looking for opportunities that align, as Tara was saying, what are your values, you know, where you go is, I think, ultimately in your control, but there are definitely going to be huge impactful opportunities coming up.
Excellent. It's good to hear. And we do talk a lot at a lot of these UN talks about identifying values and finding careers that follow them. Yeah. It's not as easy as that in a lot of cases, and a lot of, you know, people who've gone into law looking to pay off law debts have to take that job, as it were. But we wish everyone luck in finding your value job. This is a bit of a technical question. How is climate change related anxiety measured? And assuming they're survey based, is there, you know, more and more a growing pool of participants who want to be part of these surveys? And is that sort of leading to a bigger pool of surveys, meaning better data? And that could that lead to an increase in specific support services for those people?
Good question. I might answer this one, I think. So my PhD is actually around trying to develop a measure to screen for climate anxiety for young people in particular. So there's totally people who are actually trying to work on this pretty hands down. So there is like the most kind of widely used measure at the moment was developed by Susan Clayton. So it's called like the climate anxiety scale. So it's like a psychological scale. Like you might have completed scales for mental health before when you've completed like a DAS, so a depression, anxiety, stress scale, or maybe a Kessler psychological distress scale. So these are kind of questions that ask how you're feeling, how distressed you are, and these this scale is particularly around how distressed you are about climate change. I think having these scales are really important. This was a scale that was used first it was used in the US, but now there have been countries all over. I get these updates all the time through Google Scholar about all these different other countries who are adapting the scale for their particular country. So there's like a German one, there's French, they're moving into other countries too. So it's definitely something that is growing. There's more people that we're getting data from. We're starting to really understand this from a global perspective. And of course, that is going to help us to be able to tailor what we need from services to be able to respond to people and what they're feeling and how they're responding and what their psychological needs are. I think that, having a validated scale is really what can do that. It can help to provide us some guidance around how we can help.
So how much info can you get from the more generic stuff like, ABC's Vote Compass has a few questions about climate change? Is that sort of useful, or do you really need more tailored information?
I mean, I think it's helpful from a population perspective to know those general questions around how people are feeling or how they're acting, what they're thinking. But we find that those psychological scales that are validated can be helpful because it is more specific and it really tells you what exactly these people are needing, and professionals can use these kinds of scales to then tailor their support based on that. So I might, see someone's scores on a measure and then go, okay, this person's feeling, this way about this thing. And so I'm going to develop their treatment or their support strategy based on their scores. So it can be really helpful for different reasons.
Awesome. And for those of you who are interested in that question answer, Fiona has put some cool links in the chat, so make sure you copy them. Fiona, given your experience and breadth of work, what is the most, where'd that go? From a public policy perspective, what changes should be considered by governments to address this issue? The big question. And if you want to mention an upcoming $246 billion tax cut, you can.
Okay, so this space needs a lot of work for us to really understand from a public and health policy perspective, what are going to be the big ticket items in terms of making the most impact. So I'm not going to sort of pretend that we have all the answers here. But having said that, obviously acting on climate change is the obvious, the biggest thing. If we can act on climate change, we don't need to be having these discussions, but it is climate change is happening, and it's not going to stop even if we sort of solved all our carbon emissions overnight. So we are where we are. In terms of areas for focus, I can probably put some comment. Really, there hasn't been any evidence-based, comprehensive look at what we could or should be doing in terms of adapting to climate change. We still have, if we talk about the disaster recovery space, for example, we still have these, what were once fit for purpose, flawed, but fit for purpose funding models, where a cyclone would come in North Queensland every few years. It would hit a town, they'd go back in, they'd rebuild it. And people, there'd be trauma, but people recover from that. They know it's coming. They, usually have time to get out, and they know the process. And funding comes in after an emergency and it is a true recovery. The way we are seeing these disastrous events now is they're increasing in intensity and frequency, and they're unpredictable. So waiting, just getting on and living life normally, and everybody's happy and safe and secure, and has all their needs met, secure jobs, and assuming everything is going to be safe and normal, is not the case anymore, because we just have these events back to back or on top of each other, and it's just this cumulative. People do not have time to recover any longer. So we need a shift from that kind of past potentially useful model of recovery to one of resilience and preparedness. That is something I haven't just sort of made up. That is something I'm hearing constantly from our stakeholders, our people who are actually involved in disaster recovery. It's the same message, and it's potentially even more important for mental health, because we know that if we can make people mentally resilient, they will bounce back quicker. If people are experiencing, if people's resilience is being tested over and over and over again, the risk of trauma skyrockets. So trauma, one-off traumatic event, most people will be affected for a little while, but they'll bounce back. But the risk of ongoing chronic trauma and mental health issues are these repeated exposures. So they're just a couple of things mentioned, but really there's a whole lot of policy levers or policy areas that need to be addressed. But the first thing is sitting down and talking about it and looking at it, doing more research, and actually drawing up some proper policies and plans.
Thank you. So yeah, it's really interesting. I actually work in government, so it's really keen to hear your response to that. I think we all know we have to do a lot more. And I think you touched on it nicely that if just watching the news of the repeated floods in southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales, people who just look lost at, the third or fourth iteration of this disaster they've had in the last, 5-6 years. It's quite heartbreaking. it's just hit 7 o'clock, and I might try and wrap one more question into my favorite end question, which is for both of you. And it's always, what is your one takeaway you'd love for the viewers tonight to remember as they go off into their lives and their long careers fighting for climate action? But also with a bit of a tinge of a question from Ellie, what's the most effective coping mechanism you would recommend for those struggling with climate anxiety? So if you can wrap up, what's your number one coping mechanism with what's your number one takeaway for the evening, that'd be awesome. And we can move on to the close of the event.
Let you go, Tara.
That's a good question.
Yes.
Number one coping mechanism is going to be action, I think. Action is the antidote of anxiety. That's how we deal with anxiety, through action. And that's why the anxiety is there. So that's what I would recommend in terms of helping you to cope. That's going to be a one-way ticket to a sense of agency and a little bit of hope and a little bit of connection. And that can be through, like we've been talking about, through your values, or you know, even if it's small things, small little acts that you can do every day, those can really help you. It might feel small, but they can be big over time. So that's probably my biggest thing. The other question you had was around something I want you to take away. I really hope that you understood from my talk that it's totally okay how you feel. If you feel any which way about the climate crisis, your emotions are going to change over time, and that's understandable, and it's okay. And it's important for you to be there for yourself and be really compassionate to that, and to know that other people are going through the same thing, and to reach out and talk to other people about it too.
Yeah, they're good. I'd agree with Tara that action is super important, and I'm going to make an assumption that, you know, the kind of people, young people who of today and people who've turned up to you're turning up tonight is action. So you've well done. You're already taking action. So I guess I would say is work out what action means for you, what works for you, because for me, my personal experience, there's also a danger in feeling that I need to take so much action that it's actually overwhelmed me. And I've ended up in a position where I have self-imposed the weight of the world on my shoulders. And I've had to take a little bit of a step back and reassess and readjust. And I think that's a constant thing. It's a constant resetting of what you're doing in the space, and whether it's serving you, your mental health, as much as it is the world around us. And my last point would be to just have hope. You know, this is a really difficult topic, and we're in a really difficult global situation, but I do see a lot of hope. And I see a lot of hope for you guys in terms of the opportunities that are going to will lay ahead, in terms of really great career opportunities in this space. I just think that maintain an optimistic outlook.
Awesome, thanks so much. And really important words to remember the event by. I'll quickly throw to our National Comms Manager, Ellie Scales, for a quick close, and then we will let you head back to your evening. Ellie.
Thanks, Joel. Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for tuning in. Obviously, as Joel mentioned at the beginning, this is our second event out of 4 on climate action. So stay tuned across our social channels to find out more about the next one that's coming in October, towards the end of October, which will be all around how you can have actionable things in terms of your career and financial choices. So talking about things like superannuation. So there'll be more details coming out about that. And then our 4th event, which will be all about personal consumption in November, early December time. So definitely stay tuned. And then for those who are based in Queensland, our YP team there will be also hosting a World Yoga for Peace event. That's at 9 a.m. on the 10th of September at St. John's Cathedral in Brisbane. So again, just tune into social platforms to find out more if you're interested interested in joining that one. And also just, I guess, really timely that next week on Thursday is actually Are You OK Day. So on the topic of mental health, I think it's a really important day, and there's some really great resources. So we can drop the link in the chat, and hopefully you can all engage with that, even if it's just going for a walk by yourself, or making a phone call to a friend. I think there's small things that we can do. It's different for all of us on what we can do and how we can celebrate that. And stay up to date with us in general on our social channels. So I've just dropped the link for our LinkedIn. We do also have Facebook and Instagram, so you can find us on all of those. And thanks again for attending, and hope you all have a good night.
Thanks all.